The maid's lips barely moved, but I heard every word like a gunshot in a silent church. Run, just that. One syllable wrapped in a breath, buried under the smell of roasting garlic and candle wax drifting from behind the mahogany door my son had just opened for me for the first time in 2 years. 2 years. 730 days of silence, if you want to count them the way I did. Alone, in a small apartment with a coffee maker that only makes enough for one, listening to a phone that never rang. And now here I was, standing on a porch that smelled like money, wearing the same gray coat I'd had since before everything fell apart, staring at a woman in a black uniform whose eyes were wide with something I hadn't seen directed at me in a long, long time, fear and pity, tangled together like wires about to spark. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a dramatic woman. I raised a son alone on a nurse's salary in a city that chews up single mothers and spits out their exhaustion like sunflower seed shells on a sidewalk. I did not cry at his wedding, though I wanted to. I did not cry when he stopped calling, though God knows I wanted to then too. I built a wall around myself, brick by brick, the way you do when the alternative is drowning. So when I tell you that hearing that one whispered word made my knees go soft beneath me, made the porch light blur into a halo of gold, you should understand that it takes a great deal to shake me. That whisper did. Let me take you back. Let me take you back to where this really started, because a whisper like that doesn't happen in a vacuum. Nothing does. My son's name is Daniel. I named him after my father, a quiet man who fixed watches for a living and believed that anything broken could be repaired if you were patient enough and loved it enough. I used to believe that too. About the watches, about my son, about almost everything until I didn't anymore. Daniel was easy to love as a boy. Sensitive, sharp, the kind of child who noticed when you were sad before you'd said a word about it. His father left when Daniel was 4, walked out on a Tuesday with a suitcase and an apology that fit on a sticky note, and after that, it was just the two of us against a world that never seemed to run out of ways to test us. I worked doubles at the hospital. I sold my mother's jewelry when the electric bills came due one brutal January. I sat up with him through fevers, through heartbreaks, through the long, terrifying nights of his teenage years when I didn't know if he was safe or where he even was. I gave that boy everything I had, and when I ran out of everything, I found a way to give a little more. And then he met Vanessa. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even now, even after everything. Vanessa was beautiful in the practiced way of a woman who has spent a lot of time in front of mirrors that agree with her. She was polished, charming in short bursts like a commercial. And from the very first dinner I had with the two of them, a dinner she chose, at a restaurant she chose, where she corrected the waiter twice and never once asked me a question about myself, I felt something cold settle low in my stomach. Call it instinct. Call it a mother's radar. I've learned, over 61 years on this earth, that the feeling in your stomach is rarely wrong, even when your heart desperately wants it to be. Within a year, Daniel changed. Small things first. He stopped calling on Sundays the way we always had. Then he stopped answering when I called him. Then came the wedding, a lavish, glittering affair that I was invited to but seated. I noticed at a table near the kitchen doors, 3 tables away from people I had never met, while Vanessa's family sat in a place of honor beside my son. I told myself it was an oversight. I told myself a lot of things that year. Then, on a rainy Thursday in October 2 years ago exactly, Daniel called me. His voice was flat, rehearsed, like he was reading from a script someone else had written for him. He said that he and Vanessa needed space, that my involvement in his life was, and I remember this word specifically because it took the air out of my lungs, toxic. That perhaps it was best if we took a break from each other for a while, so he could focus on his marriage, on his new life, on becoming, in his words, his own man. I did not scream. I did not beg. I said, okay, Daniel, I love you. Call me when you're ready. And then I hung up the phone, sat down on my kitchen floor, and did not move for almost 3 hours. 2 years passed like that. Silence stretched out so long it became its own kind of language. I sent birthday cards that went unanswered. I heard through a cousin that Daniel had left his steady job as an accountant to help manage some investment venture of Vanessa's family. Something involving property. Something involving numbers that never quite added up when I thought about them too hard. I heard he'd moved into a house that made the modest home he grew up in look like a shoebox. I heard secondhand filtered through people who barely knew him anymore that he seemed different, thinner, quieter, that something in his eyes had gone flat like a light switched off in a room nobody uses. And then, 3 days ago, my phone rang and it was him. His voice cracked on the first word, Mom, just that. And something in me, something I thought had scarred over completely, right along with it. He said he missed me. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he wanted me to come to dinner at the house, to meet properly, to start rebuilding what had been broken. He said Vanessa was cooking. He said it would just be the 3 of us. Quiet, no pressure. He said, I need you here, Mom. There's something I have to tell you, and I can't say it over the phone. I should tell you that some deep, ancient part of me, the same part that felt cold at that very first dinner 3 years ago, did not believe a single word of it. But hope is a strange, stubborn animal. It doesn't care what your instincts whisper. It grabs onto the smallest crumb and builds a whole feast around it. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What mother wouldn't? So there I was, 3 days later, standing on that porch in my gray coat, watching my son's front door swing open, not with Daniel behind it, but with a maid, a stranger, a young woman with tired eyes and trembling hands, who took one long look at my face, glanced quickly over her shoulder into the house behind her, and leaned in so close I could feel her breath against my ear. "Run," she said again, quieter this time, more urgent. "Please, before he sees you standing here, before it's too late." And behind her, deep in the house, past the flickering candlelight and the smell of a dinner clearly meant to look perfect, I heard something that stopped my heart cold in my chest. Daniel's voice, low, tense, arguing with someone. And Vanessa's voice cutting back over his sharp as glass, saying words I will never forget as long as I live. "She has to sign it tonight, Daniel. Tonight, or none of this works." The maid's fingers were still trembling against the doorframe, and for one long, suspended second, I stood frozen between two versions of myself. The mother who wanted nothing more than to run into that house and hold her son, and the woman who had spent 2 years learning, slowly and painfully, how to survive without him. It was that second woman who made the decision. I did not run. I did not turn and flee down the porch steps the way the maid so desperately wanted me to. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I stepped back, quietly, into the shadow of the large hedge beside the entrance, pulling the maid gently with me, out of the light, out of sight of the windows. "Tell me," I whispered quickly, "what is happening in there?" She looked at me like she couldn't believe I hadn't bolted. Her name, I would learn later, was Marisol. She had worked for Vanessa's family for 11 months, and in that time, she told me in a shaking whisper, she had watched a young man slowly disappear inside his own house. She said Daniel didn't sleep most nights. She said there had been shouting matches behind closed doors, papers spread across the dining table, late into the evening, phone calls where Daniel's voice cracked with something that sounded like fear. And 3 days ago, the same day he had called me, weeping, asking me to come to dinner, Marisol had overheard Vanessa and her father on the back terrace talking in low, business-like tones about a document, about a signature, about my name. It turned out that 2 years ago, right around the time Daniel had cut me out of his life, my late mother's small piece of land, the very land I had once sold pieces of jewelry to help pay taxes on, land that had passed to me and that I had long ago written into my will to eventually pass to Daniel, had quietly increased in value beyond anything any of us could have imagined. A new commercial corridor was being planned 2 towns over, and my mother's modest acreage sat directly in its path. Developers were circling. Vanessa's family, deep in real estate, had apparently known this for over a year, and the toxic mother, the one who needed to be pushed out of her son's new life for his own good, that story had never been about protecting Daniel's marriage at all. It had been about clearing me out of the picture so that no one would have to explain or negotiate or share when the time came to talk about that land. 2 years of silence hadn't been an accident or immaturity or a young husband finding his footing. It had been a strategy, a long, patient, calculated one. And tonight's dinner, the tears on the phone, the trembling voice, the plea for me to come, wasn't reconciliation at all. It was the final move. Vanessa needed a signature on a document that would transfer my rights to that land into a trust controlled, conveniently, by her family. And she needed Daniel, the one person who could get me through that door without suspicion, to deliver me to the table. I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a strange, terrible calm settling over the panic. You would think betrayal like that would break a person. And it did, for a moment. Standing there in the dark, beside a stranger who had risked her own safety to warn me, I felt the last fragile thread of hope I'd been carrying for 2 years finally snap. But grief, I have learned, has a shelf life, even grief for a son who is still alive. And when it expires, something else moves in to take its place. For me that night, it was clarity. I did not run, and I did not walk away either. I walked in. I want you to picture the look on Daniel's face when I stepped through that door, calm, composed, my coat still buttoned, the maid slipping silently past me toward the kitchen as though we had never spoken. Vanessa was seated at the head of a beautifully set table, candles flickering, a folder tucked just slightly beneath her linen napkin, not quite hidden, not quite shown, the mark of someone who has rehearsed casualness and failed. Daniel stood when he saw me, and for one flickering second, the mask slipped and I saw my son underneath it, thin, exhausted, eyes rimmed with a guilt he hadn't fully buried. Whatever he had become in 2 years, some part of that boy who once noticed when I was sad before I said a word was still trapped in there watching helplessly. I sat down. I let Vanessa pour me wine I had no intention of drinking. I let her walk me gently, sweetly, through a story about family, about starting fresh, about how she'd always wanted a mother figure in her life since losing her own mother young. A detail I would later learn was a complete fabrication, one of at least a dozen small, expertly placed lies she'd built her marriage on. And when, after the plates were cleared, she finally slid that folder across the table with a practiced, tender smile and said, "Daniel and I just need your signature on this so we can finally move forward as a family together." I looked at my son, not at her. I looked directly at Daniel and I asked him one simple question. "Do you know what this is?" His silence lasted 3 seconds. "But I have delivered bad news to families in hospital hallways for 30 years. I know exactly how long 3 seconds of guilty silence feels." And exactly what it means. It means yes. It means he knew. I did not scream. I did not throw the folder across the table, though God knows some primal part of me wanted to. Instead, I closed it gently, slid it back toward Vanessa, and I told them both, in the calmest voice I have ever used in my life, that I would need my own lawyer to review any document before I signed anything, a lawyer of my choosing, on my own timeline. Vanessa's smile cracked, just slightly, at the edges. And that was when I understood with total certainty that everything Marisol had told me on that porch was true. What they did not know, what no one in that gleaming candlelit house knew, was that I had spent the last 2 years of silence doing far more than grieving. I had spent them working, quietly, methodically. The kind of work a nurse learns to do without anyone noticing, moving through a crisis with steady hands, while everyone else panics. I had already met 3 months earlier with an estate attorney of my own, a woman named Priscilla Ford, who specialized in exactly this kind of family land dispute. After a routine letter from the county about zoning changes had made me suspicious enough to start asking questions on my own. I already knew about the commercial corridor. I already knew roughly what that land might be worth. I had simply been waiting to see whether my son would come back to me out of love or out of need. Now I had my answer. I stood from that table with a steadiness that startled even me, thanked Vanessa for the meal with the same practiced politeness she had used on me all evening, and told Daniel quietly that I would speak to him alone without her whenever he was ready to have an honest conversation. Then I walked out of that house the way I had walked in, unhurried, unbroken, and very much still standing. 3 weeks later, everything came apart for them, exactly the way these things tend to when they're built on lies instead of foundations. Vanessa's family's development deal collapsed when the county announced a delay in the commercial corridor project pending an environmental review. A review that, as it turned out, Priscilla had quietly helped trigger by asking the right questions to the right people. Without a fast, guaranteed payout, the investors Vanessa's father had lined up walked away, and the debts they'd taken on in anticipation of that payout came due all at once. I heard through the same distant cousin who once told me about Daniel's new house that Vanessa and her family were selling assets fast to cover what they owed, and that the marriage, that glittering performative marriage, did not survive the collapse. Daniel called me on a Tuesday, the same day of the week his father had once walked out with a suitcase, though I don't think Daniel remembered that detail, or maybe he did, and that's exactly why he chose it. His voice was different this time, not rehearsed, not polished, just tired and young and finally, achingly honest. He told me everything, how Vanessa had convinced him, slowly, over months, that pushing me away was the only way to save their marriage, and how once I was gone, she had used that distance to build a case, quietly, for why the land should belong to their family instead of mine. He told me he hadn't fully understood what he was part of until it was already happening, and by then, he said, he was too ashamed to call and admit it. I did not pretend it didn't hurt. I did not tell him it was okay. Because it wasn't, not entirely, and I have never believed in lying to protect someone from a truth they need to sit with. But I told him the door was open, the way it always had been, because that's the thing about a mother's love. It doesn't vanish just because it's been wounded. It simply waits, patiently, the way my father used to wait over a broken watch, believing that some things, given enough time and enough honesty, really can be repaired. If there is one thing I want you to carry with you from this story, it is this. Silence is not always peace, and forgiveness is not the same thing as blindness. You can love someone with your whole heart and still refuse to hand them a signature you haven't read. You can walk through a door you were warned not to enter, not out of foolishness, but because you have already done the quiet work of protecting yourself long before anyone else even knew you needed to. Real strength isn't loud, it doesn't scream in doorways or throw folders across dinner tables. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a gray coat, sitting calmly at a table full of people counting on her fear, closing a folder gently and simply saying, "Not tonight."